This week we're continuing our sermon series, doing an overview of the book of Revelation. A couple of points that we've made over the last couple of weeks that I want to recap in case you either haven't seen it or you just need to be reminded. First, Revelation's apocalyptic literature. It's not history written in advance. It's actually a way of using spiritual symbols to help first century Christians, the original audience of this text, to decipher what's going on in their world by giving them a glimpse behind the curtain into the spiritual realm that is shaping and driving events in the natural world. It has relevance to us today, but it's really, at its core, a letter to a bunch of first century Christians, helping them to live as dissident disciples of Jesus in the midst of the Roman Empire that wants them to compromise. Last week we looked at how Babylon is a symbol of human institutions holding themselves out as if they are divine in the way that the Roman Empire did. God calls the church to come out of Rome, of Babylon, and to live differently. This different way of living is the way of the Lamb, and that's what I want to focus on this week. So John's original audience, the church in Asia Minor, the Aegean coast of modern Turkey, at the end of the first century, lived under persecution. And when the church lives in that place, it's probably easy to ask yourself, where's God in the midst of all of this? We're being thrown into jail. Some people are being killed, all because we're not willing to offer a pinch of salt to the emperor or something. Why don't we just compromise? Or why doesn't God step in and save us? And so John takes us into, the greatest unseen place of all of the unseen places, into the throne room of God. In Revelation chapter 4, we see God is on the throne, a comforting idea. Creation bows down and worships God, and that's great, but it might feel a little bit disconnected from the day-to-day realities of the people in the churches. But then in chapter 5, we see something that gives us hope. God sitting on the throne as a scroll in his hand. And in the Old Testament prophets, scrolls were symbols of God's judgment. And so there is a plan that God has to bring judgment on the world, to put right what is unright, to undo the evil and stop the persecution that God's people are facing. And so they can have hope. Yay, God's coming to the rescue. But there's a problem. This scroll is sealed with 7 seals, and no one can be found who is worthy to open those seals. And so it looks like God's plan to set the world right is just going to stay a plan. This is, of course, a very sad thing, because we all long to see God put the world right, at least if we're on God's side. And so John is tempted to despair. He begins to weep when one of the elders standing around the throne gives him a word of encouragement. In Revelation 5:5, we read this. Then one of the elders said to me, "Do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has triumphed. He is able to open the scroll and its 7 seals." So lions symbolize power, the kings of the jungle, after all. And when Jacob blesses his sons, the patriarchs of the individual tribes of Israel, he says to Judah that he's a lion's cub and that the scepter will never depart from him, prophesying that one day the family of Judah will be the one that leads them. And that's what happens. One of Judah's descendants, David, becomes Israel's great king, and his descendants become the line of kings. That God promises that one of his descendants will sit on the throne forever. And so this symbol of power and this invoking of the Davidic dynasty, this is the kind of thing that gets people excited because it speaks to their deepest hopes, that God is sending the Messiah, the king, to deliver the people. But then there's a strange twist here. And we read it starting in verse 6. It says, "Then I saw a lamb, looking as if it had been slain, standing at the center of the throne, encircled by the 4 living creatures and the elders. The lamb had 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the earth. He went and took the scroll from the right hand of him who sat on the throne. And when he had taken it, the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders fell down before the Lamb. Each one had a harp, and they were holding golden bowls full of incense, which are the prayers of God's people. And they sang a new song, saying, 'You are worthy to take the scroll and open its seals, because you were slain. And with your blood you purchased for God persons from every tribe and language and people and nation. You have made them to be a kingdom and priests to serve our God, and they will reign on the earth.'" So John hears the person discussing these symbols of messianic hope, but when he turns and looks at this with his own eyes, he sees something very different. Because Jesus is fulfilling our hopes, but he's also upending our expectations. Have you noticed in the Gospels that there seems to be a disconnect between Jesus and his disciples? The disciples figure out that Jesus is the Messiah, the chosen king, the promised one that's going to come and deliver Israel. But when Jesus tells them what that's going to entail, his rejection, his suffering, his death, they just refuse to believe it. Because their idea of what needs to happen, what God needs to do to fulfill his promises, is shaped by their experience living under the thumb of Babylon. Well, here too, Jesus has overcome. And he is worthy and powerful, but he is these things by being the Lamb. Throughout the rest of the book, John never mentions the Lion of the tribe of Judah again, but he refers to the Lamb over and over again. As if to say, these expectations, these hopes that you have are fulfilled in Jesus, but Jesus' fulfillment of these looks very different than what you thought it would look like. So why is John trying to subvert people's messianic expectations? Well, I think it is because the expectations that people have about what the Messiah is are shaped by their experience living in Babylon or under the Roman occupation. Rome's great power is its willingness and its ability to inflict pain and death. They have the strongest army, so no one can stand up to them. And once they've conquered your people and occupied it, if you as an individual stand up against Rome, they are willing to engage in all sorts of brutality, including crucifixion, in order to keep you in line. When that's what you see as power and authority, then you think that God's promised king must look an awful lot like that. It's just he needs to be stronger. And so everybody thinks that Jesus must be some sort of military ruler who's just more deadly than the Romans. But Jesus doesn't overcome Rome by outroaming Rome, but instead by obedient submission to the will of the Father, even to the point of death. Jesus recalibrates our understanding of power and glory and honor. Now, I love shooting landscape photography. And if I was trying to shoot some landmarks in the Kursk area of Russia, I might have a hard time if I took a map and a compass and decided to try and strike out across country to find something. Because there's a very large iron ore deposit that causes a magnetic anomaly. And if that magnetic anomaly means that north is that way, but my compass is telling me north is that way, then when I set out for my destination, I'm going to end up over there instead of over here. And so it is in the spiritual realm. If we don't first properly calibrate our understanding of what true north is, then even when we try to find good places, we're going to end up in the wrong destination. When we live in Babylon, when we see power being demonstrated through violence and selfishness and extraction. It has a distorting effect on our understanding of how the world works. But John is asking us to see the world with eyes that are corrected, with lamb vision, that we can recalibrate our understanding of true north and see the slain lamb not as a helpless victim, but as a victorious king. And following the lamb doesn't mean being defeated by it, but being victorious and overcoming, even if that victory looks like defeat to eyes that are adapted to life in Babylon. So this, of course, begs the question, is lamb-likeness just something that Jesus does to fool the enemy so that he can sneak a fast one in and deliver his people? There's a lot of Christian pop culture that envisions Jesus coming meek and mild as the lamb to be crucified and then raised. And the promise is when he comes back, he's not going to be meek and mild. He is going to be a butt kicker. He was killed as the lamb and he was raised as the lion. Well, the book of Revelation does not project this idea. Jesus is the lamb. He is the lamb on the throne. He's not converted himself into a lion now that he's been slain. And so we must take seriously that Jesus overcomes not as the lion, but as the lamb. And if we say he has to come back as the lion, then we rob the cross of its power. It becomes nothing more than a provisional victory that needs to be followed up by some serious butt kicking. So, in Revelation, the church is called to follow the Lamb in his example. In Revelation 14:1, we read this. Then I looked, and there before me was the Lamb standing on Mount Zion, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his Father's name written on their foreheads. They followed the Lamb wherever he goes. They were purchased from among mankind and offered as firstfruits to God and the Lamb. This 144,000, that's 12 times 12 times 1,000, are a symbolic representation of God's people. And they follow the Lamb. In other words, they adopt this same lamb-like posture in the world. And by so doing, they witness to Jesus' victory, allowing God to work in them. It is their weakness that is the point. Because when in weakness we overcome, through God's power, we call attention to God's power at work in us. The Lamb changes our understanding about how God is winning. We see this in the life of the Apostle Paul. Paul accomplishes so much. He wrote so much of our New Testament. He brought the gospel to new places all over the Roman Empire. We think of Paul as the guy who could do nothing wrong. But Paul was frustrated about his own ministry, about some sort of physical impediment. Something was wrong. He doesn't tell us what. He simply describes it as a thorn in the flesh without going into any detail. And I think that Paul seems to be thinking, God, I could do so much more for you if you just get rid of this ailment. Think about me at full strength, working for the kingdom. Please, God, take it away from me. And at that point, God speaks to him and challenges him to see his weakness and his limitations in a different light. Paul recounts this to the Corinthian church. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 8 to 10, he says, 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it, the thorn in the flesh, away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong. He's saying that when we exhibit weakness, when we live in the place where things don't go right, but we try to be faithful anyways, God's power shows all the more through us. Because people see it's not about how amazing we are, it's about how amazing the God at work in us is. But this isn't the way the world teaches us to live, is it? The world says you have one life, live it your way. Make much of yourself. Look out for number one. But if the Lamb is glorious, if he is the overcomer, then he flips our very idea of what the good life is on its head. Following the Lamb means following his peculiar values and his peculiar witness in the world. Jesus' values are different than ours. He spends his time with the poor and the down and out. We might think that the incarnation of God come to earth would want to spend his time with the important religious scholars. And, Jesus is willing to when they ask him, so he meets with Nicodemus, for example, but he's not really focused on them. He's focused on the masses of people, the people who lack leadership, the people who've been written off by everybody else. He stands with the poor and the suffering. He has compassion on them. He doesn't reach out to people who can advance his ministry career or people who can pay him back. Jesus is plugged into God the Father and receiving his abundant life from the Father, so he doesn't need to take from anybody else, so he can generously give himself to other people. Jesus doesn't get distracted by money and power because he understands that really, in the end, material possessions don't give us status and meaning. They might give us a momentary increase in our happiness, but then they fade away and they simply become garbage. Instead, he sees that there are things of greater eternal value, things that we don't see with our eyes, things that aren't material possessions that we can own. And so we keep our eyes on what's important. As Paul writes again to the Corinthian church, "For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal." So Jesus values the eternal. Jesus values the weak. But Jesus also has a different way of witness in the world. He's a dissident. He trusts in God's promised future, and so he refuses to compromise with injustice. Sometimes we look at the world where it's broken, and we just want to sigh and throw our hands up in the air and say, it's unfortunate that it's that way, but that's just the way it always is, and that's the way it's always going to be. But Jesus calls us to imagine a new world, a world where God's will is done on earth as it is in heaven, the kingdom of God. So, for example, when we see racial injustice around us, we can say it's regrettable, it's unfortunate, but it's just the way things are. It's too bad. But what do you want us to do about it? But Jesus doesn't throw his hands up in resignation. Jesus says, I have a dream. Following Jesus means announcing a renewed creation, and as God enables us to bring it into being in our midst, in our life together as the church. Jesus also sees this world renewed, but will not use violence to achieve that. Vladimir Lenin was said to have said about the Soviet Union's creation that in order to make an omelet, you got to break some eggs. But Jesus refuses to break eggs to make the omelet. Jesus refuses to excuse the means by which he would achieve his ends with the glory of those means. Instead, he simply embodies what those means look like. And he trusts that if he is merely obedient to God, that God can use his obedience to create a whole new world through him. And so Jesus goes to the cross, trusting the will of the Father, trusting that God can take this abject failure and turn it into the most astounding success that has ever been. And so when we live by that same way, when we are willing to be victims of violence but not perpetrators of it, so that we can embody God's values in this world, we can trust that even if we die, that God can use that to bring about a renewed world. To follow the Lamb means that we embody a different way of life, that we are captured by a vision of what the world could be, and we trust that God can bring it about. But a warning. If we preach the way of the Lamb but embody the life of Babylon, then we just turn people off from God. Are we willing not just to receive what the slain Lamb is giving us, but to follow him where he leads, and trust that just as God is able to transform his submission from an act of weakness into victory, that he's able to take our submission from what feels like weakness and turn it into victory.